My name is Mandy Crypt, and I am the person who kind of made the brainchild of effing Chicago. It is a collective of tour guides behaving badly, where we get to swear and talk about whatever the fuck we want and wear whatever the fuck we want. And so, like this month, I am going to be doing 2 talks, which is unusual because I'm very, very busy, but my last month talk was very big. I started with Ted Bundy. I have to do a second version or a second episode on Ted Bundy because it was just a wild case. I'm also going to be talking about Richard Speck this month, who is called the Nurse Killer. So I love to do creepy history, I love to do true crime, and I like to do stuff that is scandalous. So this Speakeasy series is fabulous for me. And I'm pretty sure I gave Patty like 2 or 3 topics, and she's like, riots, I want it. So we're going to start by talking about the 1968 DNC riots. And before we get like super far into it, I want to talk a little bit about what is the difference between a protest or riot and a police riot. So a protest is a statement or action expressing disapproval or objection to something or someone. A riot is a violent disturbance of the peace by a crowd or an impressively large or varied display. And a police riot is a riot instigated by police that involves escalated violence. What we are about to talk about today has been ruled a police riot. So don't let anybody rewrite history. The cops really are corrupt little assholes in this story. They are part of the reason why some people say ACAB. So, 1968, August 26th to the 29th, this is when the Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago, and it was held at the International Amphitheater. A lot was going on this year. Lyndon B. Johnson announced that he was not going to seek re-election, and the DNC had to choose a new candidate. And this was kind of a free-for-all. There were a lot of people kind of throwing their hat in the ring. A lot of people really wanted his VP to take over, but then there were a lot of other people who kind of want to put their own agenda out. And this was not a calm, organized, like collected event. There was a lot of fighting within the amphitheater. So it was kind of mimicking what was going on outside the amphitheater. Earlier that year, the US refused to stop doing unconditional bombings of Vietnam, and negotiations were deadlocked. There were multiple negotiations that went on this year and the year previous, and the US was basically told, we will stop the war as long as you guys stop bombing citizens and stop bombing, innocents and stop burning down our forests. And the US is like, fuck y'all. Like, no uncertain terms. So that was going on. 1968 was also rife with anti-Vietnam War protests. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th, and Robert Kennedy was assassinated on June 5th. And this left Democrats deeply divided. There were a lot of people who felt like we had to continue the war because we were kind of like too far in to stop, and we have to win because Americans always win. And then there were a lot of people who were like, cut our losses. This is a bad war. It was bad from the beginning. We got to get out. That was the main divider for this particular convention. Vietnam was actually in its 13th year at this time, and the draft was still going on, and it was deeply unpopular. They had even started polling from people who were like in their first year of college, which was supposed to be a guaranteed out initially. This was not the case anymore. So a lot of these young people who had entire lives ahead of them and entire plans put aside were getting pulled into this war and then getting killed or severely disabled because of what was going on in Vietnam. People were incredibly upset. This was a deeply unpopular war. I can't express how bad this was. And I wasn't even there. I'm kind of a young one. Political tension's extremely high. There's a lot of public pressure to end the war. And there's also a lot of pressure like in just local municipalities because there were so many people who are like, yeah, we don't like the war, but could you stop protesting? You're kind of like fucking up everyday life for us. So, to that end, Richard J. Daley, this senior. Love that picture of him. He successfully bid to have Chicago be the host for the DNC. There were a lot of other options. Texas was a big option. There were quite a few people who wanted to hold it in Texas and in a couple of other Midwest states, but Chicago won the bid because it is centrally located, very easy to fly into, very easy to train into. So they kind of capitulated to this guy who wouldn't shut up. Daley knew the DNC was going to be a prime target for anti-war protesting, and so he decided he was going to nip that in the bud, and he was going to disallow any unpatriotic displays. He covered the entire amphitheater with barbed wire, as you can see up here. This looks more like a prison than an actual like sports arena, which is what it was. And not only did he do this, but he also brought in thousands of police and soldiers, and he had the whole thing like outfitted with like a fleet, like a legion of people. On top of all of that, he brought in like 11,000 police officers, rotated patrols around the theater like 24/7. He pulled 6,000 men from the Illinois National Guard as an additional like show of muscle. He would only issue a small amount of like demonstration permits with the intention of pulling them to try and trap people into breaking the law. I think he issued less than half a dozen at the time, which there were a lot of people who were putting in permits to actually demonstrate at this point. He hated protesters. He saw them as ruiners of triumph and revolutionaries bent on American destruction. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, no reason, just sounds familiar. He did absolutely everything possible to discourage and outright ban protesters from coming to Chicago for the DNC. And mind you, when the DNC comes, or the RNC, any big national convention, whenever something like that comes to a town, there is millions of dollars brought in for tourism and for professional like business. So to try and discourage thousands of people to come and spend money in your city, I mean, even if they're going to be upset at something and they're going to protest, that's still a lot of money. And you know what Chicago really likes? Money. So, one of the things that he did to try and discourage people from coming is he made very public like announcements on the news that he wasn't going to tolerate any tomfoolery, any kind of demonstrations. He actually also had a private discussion with several chiefs of police in Chicago and several other high-ranking members of the police, basically giving them free rein to do whatever was necessary in their minds to stop protesters. This could be interpreted as even beating the hell out of and killing people who were protesting. This will come into play later. With the increased police presence, it was all but assured that there was going to be violence breaking out at this point. Some organizers, having heard what was going on leading up to the actual event, they would try to add some levity, and they would try to kind of soften the blow a little bit. The Youth International Party, who I love, they're the Yippie Party. A couple of these members, they would make a couple of demonstrations before the protests, and they made a couple of like big public announcements. Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, they countered these threats in a public display, saying that they would send super hot hippie girls to seduce the delegates and give them LSD, and they would also send well-endowed hippie studs to seduce the delegates' wives and daughters. Yeah, super sexy. They also said, we're dirty, smelly, grimy, and foul. We will shit and piss and fuck in public. We will be constantly stoned and tripping on every drug known to man. And you know what? They really tried to do that. This is what the Yippie Party was all about. It was all about breaking out of convention, kind of like almost a parody of the hippie movement, being like, we're everything that you're scared of, we're coming for you. But also, like, they really wanted to like legalize things like cannabis, because at this point it's illegal. They really wanted to decriminalize drugs in general, because as we all know by this point, criminalizing it is not helping. They wanted to bring in, public housing. They wanted to bring in more affordable housing. They were wanting better job opportunities, equality amongst men and women and people of color. Like, they were a very progressive party wrapped up in a bunch of stoned college kids. So I love them. Now, Daley has many critics at this point because of the measures that he was taking. Walter Cronkite actually called all of these preparations a totally unwarranted restriction of free and rapid access to information. And then during the actual convention inside the amphitheater, Dan Rather was assaulted by Daley's police, who were undercover. He was actually punched in the stomach multiple times because he was trying to interview delegates, but he was asking, maybe a little bit of a hard question here and there, and the cops didn't like that, so they beat him up on camera. And he spoke about it in public, about how he was getting beat up by the cops. Now, the day before it happens, the Yippie Party do one more cool demonstration. They hold a campaign for their candidate, Pegasus. I love Pegasus. So Pegasus, this rally was held at Civic Center, today known as Daley Center, and their pig was their candidate. They said, if we can't have him in the White House, we'll have him for breakfast. Very succinct. Yeah, no. As you can tell, cops didn't like that. They arrested him. They arrested the pig. Chicago PD came and broke up the demonstration, arrested a bunch of the organizers and the attendees. They seized Pegasus, and to this day, his whereabouts and fate are unknown. I hope he went to a farm somewhere. Chicago, and not only was this happening, which this is the light side of it, on the other side of it, the darker side of this, the day before the convention breaks out, the Chicago police actually raided several neighborhoods in the Chicago South Side in order to arrest Blackstone Rangers and other Black Power organizers preemptively to try and take them out of the fight because racism. They assumed that because these people were fighting for civil rights, for Black rights, and for workers' rights, that they were going to be the worst offenders in this case. Very unconstitutional to arrest somebody before a crime has been committed, but these people cannot afford a lawyer, so they were kind of banking on that. Now, they also did this under the guise of saying that they were probably going to assassinate the Vice President, Herbert Humphrey. They had no real evidence to believe this, but that was their reason for arresting these people. So there's a lot going down before the riot even happened. And not only do we have all of this going on outside, inside there's a very clear division amongst the delegates between anti-war and pro-war, arguing amongst each other. And there is even conflict going on with VP Humphrey himself. Initially, he had indicated that he was actually willing to end the war. He was really interested in doing what was popular at the time, which was bringing the boys home, making sure we kind of, lick our wounds, recoup our losses, and kind of like make peace. But President Johnson was pissed that his VP was going to back out of this war and be a coward. So he called him on the phone the day that he flew in, and he had made his initial statement saying he would be open to negotiating and ending the war. And he was like, bitch, you better keep that war going. Literally, that's what he said, word for word. So President Johnson calls, he bullies his VP, and he walks back his statements and says that he would continue the war, and he would later come out and say that he regretted that decision to repeal his original thoughts. A white supremacist candidate, George Wallace, was also on the docket to speak. He spoke and ran on a platform of undoing every single right triumph that had happened in the last decade. Fuck that guy. The stage was very crowded with people clamoring on top of each other, talking over each other. People were throwing punches. It's chaos inside. And then outside, things were just as bad. So August 25th, a smaller demonstration had ended peacefully. This is the day right before the thing happens. Organizers had urged protesters to go home early, don't cause trouble, and, adhere to curfew. There was a curfew laid for protesters at the time. They had a great day. Everybody was fine. They went home. The next day, though, the next day is when things start getting really hairy. So, August 26th, the film crews can document inside the amphitheater and broadcast, but they are told that they are not able to broadcast the rioting that's going on outside because they don't want the bad press against the cops to get out. And they also were very strongly urging the press not to tell the delegates that there was protesting and rioting outside. Daley had ensured that there was not going to be a single protester that was able to walk up to that Hello Democrats sign and make an ugly scene. He basically told them, keep them away from the amphitheater, do whatever you gotta do. So most of the conflict was happening in Lincoln Park and in Grant Park. Anytime they tried to move inward, because they tried several times to march towards the amphitheater, the cops beat them back every time, saying that their permits had been revoked. Daley had rigged the electrical grid also to restrict electricity broadcasting outside of the amphitheater. So they could broadcast inside, but if they tried to bring their cameras outside and use like their generators and shit outside, it wouldn't work. He would claim it was a grid glitch and it wasn't his problem. He did it. I have no doubts. Rioting starts in Lincoln Park when cops confiscate the van belonging to a band that was scheduled to play a peaceful protest concert in Lincoln Park. They get their shit taken away, and the protesters are pissed, rightfully so, because I don't know if you know anybody who's in a band, but that shit's expensive. So protesters, they start calling the cops motherfuckers and pigs, and the cops apparently started yelling back, "Kill the commies," and released tear gas into the crowd. This is the first use of tear gas. This was a crowd of about 500 people who had come to watch the protest, to watch the concert. And while they are doing tear gas, they're beating people in the streets. They also arrested this organizer, Tom Hayden. This was his first arrest, baby's first arrest. And he gets out on bail later that day. But Tom Hayden is beaten by the cops, and he's basically told, keep yourself in line, don't go back to the protests, just stay home. And like any good, punk, he's not gonna do that. Day 2, August 27th. The next day, there is an unbirthday party held for Lyndon B. Johnson in Lincoln Park, also planned and organized by Tom Hayden. Tom Hayden's out on bail, and he's like, I'm not gonna miss my own party. So he shows up, he heads out to Lincoln Park, and of course the cops recognize him immediately. They beat him up again, and they arrest him for violating the terms of his bail. The Black Panther leader, Bobby Seale, and the Yippie leader, Jerry Rubin, they both make speeches against police brutality at this point. And apparently both of them called for roasting pigs. Read between the lines there. And then in the evening, after they do a bunch of speeches and a big display, the protest moves gradually from Lincoln Park into Grant Park. And they kind of park themselves across from the Hilton Hotel. That's where a lot of the DNC delegates and other people who had come for the convention were staying at the time. And Peter, Paul, and Mary played a concert in the park, which was very nice. Now, Daley, after hearing that Peter, Paul, and Mary are playing in the park, he sends the National Guard in, and many of the soldiers are actually the same age as the protesters, because these are all college kids, late teens, early 20s. And these kids did not sign up to beat up their friends for not wanting to go to war. So there was a little bit of conflict, a little bit of conflict of interest between the soldiers and the actual protesters. From what I understand, a lot of the National Guard didn't actually want to do this, and they did it anyway. Tom Hayden, he's again out on bail. He's got a good lawyer. He's now finally made his way back down to Grant Park. He gets a hold of a bullhorn, and he tells all the 600 protesters to go home before there's more violence. And they listen because, you listen to the guy with the bullhorn. You don't listen to the cops. Day 3, this is the big riot. This is the big baddie. So, 10 to 15,000 people gather in Grant Park. This is a huge demonstration. And they plan, come hell or high water, they're gonna march on the International Amphitheater. Police by this point had been forced into 12-hour shifts. And this is, we have over 10,000 cops at this point and around 6,000 National Guard members. This is overload to its max. Vacation and weekends had been cut off. Nobody was allowed to go home, basically. So these guys are overworked, overstressed, and they're basically told, suck it up, buttercup. You don't get to sleep, you don't get to take a shower, you gotta go out and beat up the protesters. So they're already upset, and everything that happens for the rest of the day is just gonna make things worse. This is definitely a contributing factor to what happens next. So at about 3:30 p.m., a young man lowers an American flag that's flying in Grant Park, and the cops have had enough. They force their way through the crowd to yank this kid off the flagpole, and they start beating the shit out of him. And of course, the protesters are like, pigs go home. So they start throwing things like chunks of concrete and garbage and rocks at them, trying to get them off of this kid. And there's multiple people beating on this kid. There's like 10 cops beating up one kid. And they start chanting things like, pigs go home, hell no, we won't go, and pigs are whores. When the organizer, Rennie Davis, tries to calm down the police by saying, we have a permit, they're like, no you don't. We yanked that, which is unconstitutional, by the way. If you get a permit, unless it comes down from way high up, the mayor just can't yoink your permit. Like, that's not a thing to do. That's actually silencing your rights. So know your rights before you go. So Tom Hayden, he also tries to do some crowd control. He tells the crowd to scatter because the police can't get us all. And he basically tells them that if you scatter really wide, there's a chance we can get to the amphitheater, and they can't use tear gas on all of us. They were fully anticipating the use of tear gas. The cops do not care about gassing their own people. They were throwing dozens of tear gas canisters into the crowd. And this impacted the cops themselves. So it's chaos. There were people beating on people, and they didn't even know who they were beating on. Police chased anyone in the streets and basically beating them indiscriminately. And so here's a few pictures of what this looked like. And these are just the tame ones. You can Google and you can find others that are way bloodier and way crazier. The cops, they're using mace, they're hurling slurs, doing verbal assaults while beating them with batons, punching and kicking them before they arrest them. And even when they're in handcuffs, they're still throwing them on the ground and beating the shit out of them. It's way, way overkill. It's full-on police brutality. There was a 17-minute broadcast showed of the riot that night. More footage comes out later, but this 17-minute one was really big. Now, unfortunately, that is not a free video for me to show you guys. But what I can show you, this is a silent video. This is just a little idea of what things were like. Look at dragging this kid. This guy with the bandage on his head was a medic. So is this kid here. So what he's saying in this video, because there is a little bit of audio at the end, he basically said that the cops did not care who you were. They didn't care if you were a journalist. They didn't care if you were a medic. They didn't care if you were simply a resident watching what was happening. If you were within arm's reach, you were going to get got. And he told the police, I'm a medic. I'm here to, give aid to those who are hurting, who are injured. And they said, medic, I'll give you a medic, and beat him in the head. Yeah, so this is why people say ACAP, just saying. That just gives you a little idea of what was going on. So, 17-minute broadcast goes out, and this is where the phrase, the whole world is watching, is coined. If you've ever heard the phrase, the world is watching or the whole world is watching, that's from this riot. Because this really was one of the first major riots that really was starting to kind of tip the scales in the other direction. Now, that didn't happen immediately. I'll get to the aftermath in a minute, but as people start seeing more and more of these demonstrations and more of these protests, and more young men are coming home, choking their lungs out because they got gassed by Agent Orange, they're missing legs and arms, their heads are, damaged, full of PTSD and trauma. They're coming home, shells of their former selves, and they're like, what are we doing all this for? So this is one of the first real major turns towards getting out of this war. The news crews and amateur photographers, they film all this brutality, and over the next several days, they're broadcasting it. Several delegates actually inside the convention, now that they know that this is happening, they are mentioning it on the floor. And actually the representative for Wisconsin is like, I actually vote that we hold off on voting because of what's going on outside, and we need to address this. And Wisconsin was removed from they got their right to speak removed, and people booed them off of the stage because they wanted to actually address what was going on. So, for once, I'm actually proud of Wisconsin in that case. Like, it's pretty cool. So things were getting really wild. The extreme violence is often looked on as a major contributor in the decision to actually elect Richard Nixon. Because people see this going on and they're like, the Democrats don't got their shit together. Also, does that sound familiar? Just in case you're wondering, I'm a bleeding socialist, so I'm for whoever's going to feed the kids and shit like that. So now, This happens after Humphrey vows to end the war after he secures the Democratic nomination. Like, he lied to the public to get the nomination, saying, oh yeah, I'm gonna keep the war going. And then once he's got the candidacy, he's like, psych, I'm gonna pull us out. But people had seen all this and they went, nah, we're gonna go vote for the other guy because they seem like a little bit more cool-headed. The rioting ends about midnight on August 28th. In the end, there are 688 arrests, 425 people are treated for injuries at medical stations, 200 are treated out in the streets, and about 400 people were treated for tear gas, 110 hospitalized. And this is all the protesters. The cops, across everybody, mind you, over 10,000 cops, sustained 192 injuries, with only 49 requiring actual treatment. The public views on the riots, shocking, was actually against the rioters. And I want to remind y'all, this happens every time a major important demonstration happens against oppression. Every single time, people look on the protesters as people who are disrupting the peace, disrupting the public, and then 2020 hindsight comes in and we go, they had it right, we should have listened. It happens every time. So people are against all of these things, and the media helped play into this. They were like, look at all these protesters, you know, they weren't keeping in line and the cops had to do all this stuff. They're the ones who let this get out of control. And the media kind of skewed it away from what the actual message was. Many believed the hippies were troublemakers who instigated the cops. Daley received 135,000 letters of support and only 5,000 criticizing him. I think that should have been the other way. Like, that's shocking numbers for me. Now, several independent investigations happened after the riots. A bunch of them found a shocking amount of police brutality. One of these studies says that the brutality was even upon persons who had broken no law, disobeyed no order, made no threat, and these included peaceful demonstrators, onlookers, and large numbers of residents who were simply passing through or happened to live in these areas. They found that there was excessive force used. So what else is going on after the riots? So after the riots, the Chicago 8 are arrested and charged with conspiracy and inciting a riot. The 8 are Abby Hoffman, Tom Hayden, David Dellinger, Rennie Davis, John Froines, Jerry Rubin, Lee Weiner, and Bobby Seale. Bobby Seale is the black gentleman right here. And Bobby actually fought for his right to have a separate trial, mostly because he felt like he wouldn't be judged the same in a group of white men, and also because he wanted the ability to choose his own lawyer. With a group trial, they would have kind of had to make do with who they had, and he didn't trust that he was going to get a fair trial. So he fought for and got his right to a separate trial. So he was the only one who was tried separately. But then the 7 that were left behind, and we have these 2 guys, they're lawyers, they were able to eventually get out of this case. 1970, 5 of the 8 were convicted of inciting a riot while crossing state lines, and they were also cited for contempt in court, because of course they were loud and obnoxious in court. But in 1972, those convictions were reversed, and the government declined to retrial. So basically, without saying in as many words, they were in the right, they broke no law, and we're just gonna let this one go. That was kind of the feel about it. The riots and subsequent protests failed to end the war. 1969 becomes the bloodiest year of the war, and this is the first year that Nixon takes office. 16,592 soldiers die in this year alone. That's an insane amount of people. Actually, for context, that's a little bit more than the police and soldier present at the actual DNC riots. Yeah, so, and I don't know if you guys have ever been to the Vietnam War Memorial. It's in DC. They are still adding names to that wall. Those panels were made with room to grow because there were so many who had sustained injuries from their time served that they are dying now in their old age and their middle age of the injuries they sustained. So if they can prove that their death or their injury was related to the war, after they die, they get put on the wall. And they also try to fit them as close to the year that injury was received on the wall as possible. So there's still people being added to the 1969 panel. And in case you're wondering, that's one of my favorite memorials in DC. If you've never been there, the way it's shaped, it's kind of like this big gouge in the earth. It's kind of shaped like a V. And you come in on one side, and you're literally walking down into the earth, and you can feel the weight of all these names as they tower above you. And then as you walk out the other side, as the war is ending, there are less and less names, and you're starting to feel it be a little bit lighter. But that to me is so impactful because it embodies everything that these anti-war protests were trying to say. Like, this cost is too great. I could do a whole thing on just the Vietnam War Memorial. It's literally my favorite one, and the kids never like it. It's not as grand as the Lincoln Memorial. But yeah, so eventually, as we see this bloodiest year of the war happen, people turn against the war. And they look back to these riots, and they go, man, these kids were right. And we finally start seeing major pushes from every level of society to end the war. They've basically said enough is a fucking enough. So, of course, Daley blames outside aggressors and revolutionaries for what happened at the protests. He believed that they came with the distinct purpose. Ooh.
It is a mocktail.
Yes. Hell yeah, thank you. Sweet. Hold on. It's very full. Oh, so good. All right. So he blames these outside agitators and revolutionaries and say that they are coming with the distinct purpose of causing conflict with law enforcement. And that's simply not true. A lot of the people who came to this protest literally were college kids. Like, think about young Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders was a college kid at this point, and he was making trouble and getting arrested because he was, a loudmouth Jewish guy. Yeah, he's the same age as these people, and he's still fighting for the same shit. Bringing young kids home, not having the draft, ending racism and discrimination. We shouldn't still be doing this. These kids are now elders, and we're still fighting for this shit. A lot of these kids came because they felt they could make a difference, and they get beaten in the head by cops instead. It's absolutely disgusting. The U.S. Attorney General, Ramsey Clark, he decided to hold an actual, full-on federal investigation of this protest because there was a lot of back and forth as to whether or not this was a just protest. I bumped things. Oh well, it's fine. So they do their investigation, and they did actually find that the demonstrators' civil rights were violated, and the police were quick to violence, they were too violent, and they had done overkill. Daley submitted a list of 152 injured officers, and the injuries ranged from a split fingernail to a fractured orbital bone. So at least one cop got a serious injury, but I'm sorry, did you break a nail? I should scoff harder. I don't think that got across there. But he really tried to milk it. He really tried to make it seem like the cops were, the guys who were just doing their job, they were doing their civic duty, and these kids were making their lives difficult. In the end, he would say that he did nothing wrong. He did what he thought was right. And in the end, he becomes very much criticized for it. December 1st, 1968, the investigation led by the National Commission of Causes and Preventions of Violence determined that the event was, in fact, a police riot, and that while some of the actions were warranted, failure to prosecute excessive force and violence would end in public distrust in the Chicago Police Department. So basically they said, you need to actually prosecute your bad apples, otherwise they're not going to trust you. Does that sound familiar? Nothing has changed. And people did highly distrust the cops after this because they're like, people literally just walking to and from work were getting caught up in this. You can't tell the difference between somebody who's throwing a Molotov cocktail and somebody just walking home from work. You need your eyes checked, And that brings me to the conclusion here. Time always, 100%, is gonna side with our protesters. If you look up there, Stonewall, Pride, the beginning of all of our parties in June? Yeah, that started with trans women throwing bricks at cops. And we need to bring that back. Because now they're getting queer wrath right now. The Dakota pipeline. Bunch of us went to that. Bunch of us, fought against that. Clean water shouldn't be controversial. Native land rights shouldn't be controversial. Occupy Wall Street. We are the 99%. Fighting for equal wages and equitable distribution of assets should not be controversial. There should be no billionaires. That is a hill I'm willing to die on. Elon Musk, you can eat my ass. You won't be able to do it well anyway, I guarantee you. We also have Black Lives Matter. They really do fucking matter. I don't want to hear any, White Lives Matter shit or all lives matter shit. Until everybody is treated with equal respect everywhere, I don't want to hear it. Ferguson, clean water, clean public facilities, access to housing. It's important. And our newest, the national parks. Does anyone know what the upside down American flag means? Exactly. And I can't think of a better symbol right now for what's going on in this country. Right now, and actually I think it was today, Trump made a tweet about how he was going to prosecute every illegal protester, basically calling us domestic terrorists, and that any school that allowed protesting was going to lose their government funding. Hey, Donald Trump, I'm looking right at you, Belle. You're not watching this, but looking right at you. You also can eat my ass. You can black bag me, send me to Gitmo. I don't give a shit, I need a vacation anyway. No, protesting is not illegal. Protesting is a protected right under our Constitution. The right to gather, the right to criticize when we think something is wrong. The legislative branch and the power of the people is written so that way it is equal to, and in some cases outweighs, the power of the judicial and the executive branches. So, make your voice fucking heard. With that, I'll take questions.